Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 3, season 3 of Castle's Association Leadership Series. We have an incredible program today. My name is James Donnelly, founder and CEO of the Castle Group. I've been doing these now for 3 seasons, so probably well known, but we have some guests today that I wanted to introduce. Our topic today is really proactive building maintenance. And so I want to introduce you to Sunisha Kohler, who's a executive vice president of the Falcon Group and a structural engineer. Welcome, Sunisha, and thank you for being here.
Oh, welcome. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you and everybody on the call. Thank you for having me here.
And what we wanted to do today is kind of marry Sunisha's technical expertise with the practical management of your community. And a lot of you know Will Delgado, the president of the Castle Group. What you may not know is Will spent a lot of his career building condominiums. So we rely on him a lot internally for best practices as it relates to the physical plant. And I also want to tell you, we normally have Donna DiMaggio Berger of Becker online, but she was not 100% today. So she sends her regrets. And Donna, if you're watching, I hope you're watching, we're sending you healthy thoughts. So just a couple reminders before we get going. We often get asked for copies of past episodes, and they are all on our website at castlegroup.com under the association leadership icon. And I also want to say Sunisha has been very, very generous in giving us his time today. But if you want his real engineering opinion, you're going to have to pay for it, right, Sunisha? And we're going to talk about that. We get a lot of questions from our clients. How do you hire an engineer? What are the criteria? How much does it cost? So we're going to answer those today. And we do have listeners, most of our listeners in Florida, but we do have some in Texas. And so we will get some answers that are state specific, but for the most part, everything we talk about today is very much universal. And then we're going to do some polling. We're going to start soon with polling. And also, Marinette gave you the instructions on Q&A. You submitted over 100 questions before when you registered. So we've incorporated a lot of those into our program today. But if you have any questions that come up throughout, just use the Q&A function. And I'm monitoring it while I moderate the discussion between Sunisha and Will. So today, I think the best way to break it down is we're going to talk about building inspections, reserves, and preventive maintenance. But we really want to get a flavor for our audience today. And I want to start with a poll question. Marinette, if you'll put up poll question 1, we just want to know whether you're associated with a condominium or HOA, and give us some flavor for how old your community is. And you'll notice, you have to scroll down a bit to get all of the different categories. So look at this. I'm not surprised. We are higher on condominiums, Sunisha and Will, because of the nature of our topic. But Sunisha, I do want to maybe ask a question while these are being answered. We have a lot of larger HOAs that have huge amenities, clubhouses. So I think a lot of what you'll talk to today, even though it may be more focused on condominiums, certainly applies to HOA's common elements. Do you agree?
Correct. Yes. By all means, especially they have a larger clubhouses and things like that. That would consider buildings themselves in terms of what we call a low-rise or a mid-rise building. Definitely, some of these things apply.
Excellent. Well, Marinette, let's share the results so our audience know who their peers are on the webinar today. So we have 79% condo, 13% HOA. That's excellent. And then look at the age. That's probably reflective of the condominium stock in Florida and Texas, because we started building them not long ago. But and also not surprised, gentlemen, we've got 34 plus 49, 83% are over 20 years. And those are the buildings we're really talking a lot to today. So that's great. If you can take that off the screen for me. I also wanted to say that, that the tragedy the Surfside, the Champlain Towers South tragedy was obviously just beyond comprehension. And there's so many questions about why and how can we prevent that from happening again? And those are great questions. I wanted the audience to know there are two studies already published that one was done by the Florida Bar, and it's about a 179-page report. A task force was put together of experts to say what policy recommendations should we be recommending to Tallahassee. And a second report was done by the Community Association Institute nationally. And both those reports are really, if you haven't read them, Marinette, let's put a link on the CASA Group website so it makes it easy for our audience. But as a board member, it's really interesting to read those reports and think about the decisions you're making right now. But Sunisha and Will, the recommendations are really around inspections, reserves, and the board's ability to assess, because even if you've identified the need, if you can't right now under a lot of law, Florida and Texas law, you need to get a vote of the owners. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that was a good idea, but obviously there's some flaws in that. So with that, I want to now go to question 2, because I'm going to tee you up, Sunisha. I want to see how many, poll question 2, Marinette, how many of our boards have an engineer on the board? And I'm expecting where this answer is going to go, and that's going to lead me right into the need for an engineer, third party. So, Sunisha, just as a little bit of background, tell us about the Falcon Group. You are a engineering firm in how many states?
We're currently in, I believe, 6 states, all on the East Coast of the United States.
And how many engineers?
Well, we have 110 people on staff. Majority of them are engineers by education. A lot of them have a license as well. And then we have obviously administrative staff.
And you are a structural engineer.
Correct.
So I know there's different types of engineers like civil and MEP and structural. Maybe just for our audience, what is it a structural engineer focuses on versus maybe a mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineer?
Sure. So structural engineers, as the name says, are focused on a structure, meaning the support system of the building, as opposed to architects who primary job is to design the aesthetics and function of a building. The structural engineer's job is to make sure that that structure basically stays in place. So that is the function of a structural engineer. As opposed to them, you have, for example, civil engineers, and that distinction in the United States specifically is not often very well defined. But for all intents and purposes, the civil engineer is somebody who is focused more on a flat work, meaning roads and drainage and something like that. The structural engineers are focused more on a structure itself. Mechanical engineers, obviously, the mechanical systems, HVAC, ventilation, heating, cooling. Electrical engineers are obviously everything to do with electrical conduits, lights, generators. Plumbing engineers, drainage, sewer, storm, and so on and so forth. So there are life safety engineers, are people who design life safety escape routes and things like that to safely evacuate a building. So we have, plenty of experts involved, especially when we get to the design of a new structure.
Well, Will, we really wanted for this particular episode to have structural, but a lot of the preventive maintenance discussions we're going to have in a minute here apply to all. Will, we often get asked by our clients to help them hire engineers. So how do we as management respond to that? I know we have lots of relationships like we have with Sunisha, but kind of walk us through, if we're asked by a board to hire an engineer, what process do we go through and how do we make a recommendation?
Yeah. So first I'd like to take note, James, of those results there. And, I frequently ask our boards, how many of you do have either architectural or engineering experience when they start talking about significant projects? And here, as you can see, we have a little bit greater than 3/4 of our boards have no experience. So yes, we're frequently asked, can you recommend someone? And, within the Castle Group, we maintain a number of relationships throughout the state of Florida with great firms like the Falcon Group, because we know what types that. I'm glad you went through the different definitions, Sunisha, as to what particular engineer does what, because our customers frequently just don't know. So we do maintain relationships. We're able to bring in engineers. Typically, we'll bring in 3 firms or so, allow the board to have an opportunity to interview, see who is a right fit, just as much as we have what we like to call chemistry between our management team and the board. We'd like to have the same between the board and the engineer, given the level of trust that's needed between the two and the advice and expertise that the engineer is going to bring to that project.
Yeah, and for our audience, obviously all the management companies, all my competitors in Castle, we know who the people who kind of specialize in our area of work. So, my answer is always go to your management company and they will find you the Sunishas of the world. And for self-managed communities, it's a little more difficult, but honestly, any one of the management companies in Florida or Texas would be happy to help you out, even just with a recommendation. I think, Sunisha, I get a lot of questions about how much does this cost? And obviously cost is a really important thing. I gave you a couple of scenarios when we spoke yesterday, and I just wanted to repeat it today because I think this will be really helpful for our audience. So I gave you the scenario. I've got a 200 unit, 20-story, 20-year-old, obviously high-rise condominium, and we want to have a structural building inspection done. Does that cost $1,000, $10,000, $100,000?
Well, somewhere in between, depending on the certain options that one may propose for such inspections. But let's say that in general, such inspection would be costing somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000. Obviously, that can be tweaked depending on the particular specifics of that building and whether we would do, for example, swing stage inspections, drone inspection, destructive investigation, and things like that. Cost can go up or down, but let's say a ballpark number would be anywhere between $20,000 and $30,000.
20 and 30,000.
Correct.
And Will, I know you and I have spoken before. Once you get a relationship with an engineer you like and trust, and they're doing a good job, you would get a scope and a bid on the initial project. But then that's also the engineer that's often a good partner to be using ongoing because they have total context and reference to the report. So, Sunisha, what would it cost if we were to hire you on an hourly basis after that initial inspection?
Well, technically, there are usually 4 phases, even with the other engineers out there, as you said, my competition, where when we would discuss, there would be several phases when it comes to a project. If we talk about a facade restoration project, for example, it would involve that initial assessment, which would be in that range. Then there would be a set of writing the specifications and preparing the repair documents and details. Again, depending on the level of repairs, that could be anywhere between $10,000, $20,000, $25,000. Then you have assistance with the bidding, where we are going to a selection of a contractor, which is usually done hourly or part hourly, part lump sum. Overall, depending on the level of involvement, that can cost anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000. And then the supervision of the work. That depends on the extent of the work, the number of swing stages, the contractor's logistics, means and methods. But let's say that could cost $15,000, $20,000, $25,000, and $30,000 per month for engineering services. As a good rule of thumb, empirically speaking, for at least for Falcon Group, I can tell you that on a projects that are costing anywhere up to, let's say, $1 million in construction value, the engineering services of that last section are probably 12 to 15% of the construction cost. Projects that are million and let's say 2, 3, or 4 million, that number is 8, 10, 12, again, depending on the level of work. The projects are more than $5 million. The percentage of engineering involvement is relatively lower, let's say 6 to 8%. So that's a rough estimates on the percent base, even though we don't do percent-based contracts, but just so people have a
for budgeting purposes.
Budgeting.
Yeah.
I had a question. Go
James,
ahead,
just
Will.
one quick comment. You had mentioned briefly before about that relationship, that trusted advisor that, and when you develop that relationship with your engineer. And I've seen in the past, unfortunately, where a relationship has gone poorly and the association then decides they need to make a change. And, I think Sunisha would agree with me here. It puts a new engineer in a very difficult position. Many times associations say, just take the work of the previous engineer in terms of a report, read it, and that's where we'd like you to pick up. Well, it's incredibly awkward for the engineer to now have to pick up on someone else's word, and typically they won't do it. And now I mention this because for our associations, what does that mean? There's added cost. A new engineer, if Sunisha were to come in and says, look, guys, I can't accept someone else's work carte blanche. I'm going to need to verify what's going on here for myself. And so if we back up in this entire process, it just reinforces the need for having a very thorough interview process and ensuring that you've checked the references, you've inspected past projects of the person that you believe is going to be the engineering firm you're going forward with.
Yeah, and I like the word chemistry, Will. These are partners, long-term partners, just like property managers and attorneys. So it is important to get the right one. We had a couple of questions come in, Sunisha, when you were defining the different types of engineering. One of them was, does a structural engineer inspect roofs?
The structural engineer can inspect roofs. Usually you would want to have somebody who has some experience with the roofs. There are also some certifications that one can hold, such as a registered roof observer or inspector. So there are certain certifications that can assist with that, but just because somebody is a structural engineer doesn't mean that that person does not have plenty of experience in that field as well. It's not necessarily given that just because somebody is a structural engineer, they should inspect the roof. But overall, most of the time, that kind of connection exists.
Okay, well, we have a couple of questions on inspections, so I want to move right into property inspections. And Marinette, let's start with asking our audience when the last time their communities were inspected. Poll question 3. Well, that's going up, Sunisha. I want to. One of the questions is what are the types of inspections you can do, and I just wanted to identify regulatory required inspections. Obviously, we've got different states and different counties, and I know you're based in Miami that has an incredibly stringent regulatory inspection, but I think it's highly relevant. I'd be shocked if we don't come out of the next legislative session with higher regulatory required inspections. But right now, if we take the South Florida markets, what types of inspections are we required to have, both in terms of how often and what are those inspections comprised of? Structural, MEP, other.
So the requirements for inspections are actually not that high in Florida. You have 2 counties, Miami-Dade and Broward County, as the only 2 counties in Florida that actually have the famous or infamous 40-year, 50-year or recertification process that starts at the 4th year and then goes every 10 years after that. All other counties basically don't have any regulatory requirements for any inspections whatsoever. It's basically left to the discretion of the building itself, the board itself, to determine whether they need such work or not. That's for the condominiums. For the hospitality, for example, and some of your condos may have that Airbnb going on, short-term rentals. There is a specific requirement pertaining to inspection of the railings, where the railings have to be inspected every 5 years for safety. So on hospitality side, there is the inspection of the railings every 5 years. For the residential side, Miami-Dade and Broward have the 40-year inspection requirements. I know that Boca just recently adopted some inspection requirements. And you are right, the expectation is that after this legislative session, we will have probably more frequent and even more detailed inspections required as we go on.
So this is really why I asked you the question, Sunisha. If you think about it, I've got all these boards watching this webinar today, and there's only 2 counties that even have a requirement, which puts an incredible onus that board to go spend owners' money on inspections that aren't required. I actually think the regulation will give some relief to our community leaders because they don't have a choice. They're going to have to do these inspections. Marinus, please share the polling results with how recently our audience have done an inspection of their community, quite spread out, but a fair amount in the last year, which is nice to see. In fact, about half have done in the last 3 years. So that's good. I know those numbers are going to go up, but I thought the audience would like to see what their fellow communities are doing.
James, I just to comment on that spread, and I do believe it's an outcome of Surfside that we have a larger number in the last year. And I would tell you that, you were commenting how the 40, 50-year research as of right now does not apply to outside of Dade and Broward counties. We had customers who reached out to us from Southwest Florida saying, and this goes back to our other poll results showing the age of some of our communities who are online with us today. And they were younger communities. And they said, I don't suspect that we have a problem, but we'd like to have someone take a look as a peace of mind effort for all of our residents. And I would bring that into, it's never too early to start on having solid maintenance within our communities, because those who are the younger communities right now, they're actually ahead of the curve. This incident has provoked many people to think more deeply about maintenance. And an engineer like Sunisha would tell you that you will get the greatest useful life out of all the systems within your building if you start now taking care of them. We have seen that older properties, unfortunately, they have neglected it in the past, and then there is a great momentum to suddenly get it fixed as you get closer to 40 years. And certainly the certification requirement doesn't say wait until 40 years. It says this is what you have to meet at that time frame. But clearly you can be doing things at 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah. Sunisha, I want to ask you a couple of rapid fire questions here just to make sure we're staying in tune with our audience. Does Falcon do roof inspections? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. There's some confusion, and we're going to get into reserve studies, but there's confusion about a reserve study inspection, an engineering inspection, and then I have one question here, an insurance mandated inspection. Without going too deeply into the differences, kind of just give me the high level, because we're going to dive deep into the reserve and the engineering inspection.
So the engineering inspection is the one performed by the engineer that serves a purpose of bringing back the result of the particular thing inspected. It doesn't have to be structural, it can be mechanical, plumbing, or any other. Basically gives you assessment of the system you're inspecting. The reserve study has a function of providing the lifespan and the cost to replace of a certain item. It's more of a monetary or having the proper funds for certain work rather than giving you an assessment in the condition of the system. Whereas the inspection one is very tailored toward what the insurance company is looking for to be able to provide you with a proper rate or coverage for what they are looking at. Sometimes those can be even more stringent than either of those two, simply because the insurance company may want to cover all the bases that are not necessarily always same as the engineer looks at the building or even the reserve study.
So again, for the audience, I think this is super important because there is a lot of confusion. A reserve study nor insurance inspection meets the level of an engineering inspection. And we're going to talk a bit more about what that looks like. But, I want to be crystal clear on behalf of Sunisha and Will, those are not the same thing. Sunisha, we do get asked a question, and right now we aren't regulated and we likely will, but you had described a cycle of structural building inspection that I really liked yesterday. And that was you should inspect your building before you waterproof and paint it, because you're about to cover up things that you may not see. So I know that the quality of building coatings have increased dramatically. The warranties have increased dramatically, but historically we've kind of recommended a reseal, repaint kind of every 7 years, and it could be 5 and it could be 8 or 9 or 10 with some of the new products, but let's call it 7 for this discussion. Describe to us why building coding is a good time to inspect the structure of your community?
Well, simply said, it's because it's most practical and financially responsible to do it at that time. A lot of times, and a lot of associations actually start doing this after the first paint cycle, when when they hit the painting of the building for the first time without any inspections, and then find out that during the painting, they have stucco problems, concrete problems, other problems they need to address. And all of a sudden the project that started as a $700,000 paint job becomes $3.5 million concrete restoration and paint. So, learn by experience is why I say you should do it every time, because the painting is just what you do on the surface. The inspection of the structure prior to painting is going to allow you to understand if there are any other problems that you should include and repair at the time of the paint. Because you'll have the equipment, you'll have the team, you have everybody available, and you'll be proactive about doing your repairs. The critical thing here is actually making the buildings do that paint cycle, let's say 7 or 8 or 10 years with the newer products. That is the critical thing. A lot of times what we get is people going around the building saying, well, the paint looks great. Why are we painting the building? We have to understand that the paint has dual purpose. It serves as aesthetically covering the building and giving that looks to the building, which is one of the functions. But the other function is a protective layer on the building. The paint is the first protective layer against the environment on your building. So it still can look nice, but the thickness, the coating that serves as a protection may not be there anymore, which means now your substrate, your stucco, your concrete becomes susceptible to damages, deterioration from the environment, which makes your concrete restoration and paint job more expensive, longer, and with a bigger problem. So if we get the paint job on that cycle and we do an assessment prior to that paint cycle, I'm fairly certain that you will never be in a position to ask your community, your building, for a $15-20 million loan for a concrete restoration and paint job. You may pay $1 million or $2 million, depending on the size of the building and obviously all of that, every 10 years, but that's about it.
You know what, Will, that's called preventive maintenance. And I really, from a practical point of view, we see this a lot, especially when we take over a new community. You will go and evaluate the community for the purposes of our bid. And there's a lot of Band-Aids put over things that just get worse. What have you been your observations, Will, in this area?
Yeah, well, Band-Aids would be the correct term of choice there, James. Everything from duct tape to using the wrong materials for a stucco patch, or not knowing the complete methodology to do a stucco patch. Rust is a big one where that never happens overnight. The chemical process which creates rust takes time. And so it's a matter of someone being out there on a regular basis looking for it, and then, of course, treating it appropriately. I do want to emphasize, James, that you had mentioned the 2 reports before that we're putting on our website. In the CAI report, in the very early pages, I believe it's in the preamble, it reinforces the point that Sunisha was just making, that you address problems up front. It is considerably less expensive than when those problems have now grown over time, and you go from the paint job cost of maybe $300,000 for your building to $3 million because it's been growing over time. And that was reinforced in that same study.
Yeah, well, this was, I really, really liked, and as the audience knows, I always like to have very specific take-home value from these webinars, but and it's probably because I'm an accountant and not an engineer. I hadn't thought how specifically the inspection cycle tied to the painting cycle is a good idea. Okay, so Sunisha, you've now done an inspection of the building. What do you give the board? Is it a report? Is it actionable? Is it prioritized? What's the product that you will give to our board once you've completed an inspection?
Yes, in a general sense, after the inspection, the board will receive a report that is going to delineate the condition or the issues on the building that we observed, and he's going to give them a general recommendations of what is the next step, what should they be considering doing. In addition to all of that, I can only speak for Falcon Group, obviously, we will split those items in what we like to call required work, recommended work, and optional work. Required work being one that we absolutely think you should complete. Recommended work, the work that we, as the word says, recommend doing because either it makes sense from a financial aspect, from a time aspect, or from inconvenience aspect, from any other aspect. And then optional work that maybe there is something that you should consider doing that is not necessarily part of this, but is for a betterment or for protection of the property and things like that. And then we'll tie that with some budgetary estimates for the board to understand the cost, the impact of that work on the building.
You had mentioned to me that you were describing a difference between a kind of a vertical inspection and a horizontal inspection. And I think this also came out of the surf side. I mean, obviously the engineers always knew about it, but I think for the lay people like me on this call, talk to me about the horizontal surfaces. The vertical ones, we kind of know, we see the cracks, we see the sealing of the windows and the painting and water sealing, but the horizontal ones we don't see as much. So describe what surfaces you're talking about, and should they be inspected, and what are you looking for? Horizontal surfaces.
Yes, horizontal surfaces are probably the ones that are going to be big part of the future inspections. They are kind of overlooked right now to a certain extent, but I think they're going to be way more specifically mentioned in the future. When I talk about horizontal surfaces, I refer to, for example, roofs or pool decks, or any type of a suspended or elevated deck that you have on the property. Why those? First of all, they're for most part, they are hidden from inspections. Roofs are above everybody. Nobody knows what's happening on the roof until it starts leaking into the penthouse unit. Same goes with the deck. Nobody knows what's happening on that deck until the water starts leaking on the car parked in the garage. It's usually board president's car. And then what do we do when we see that? We put a gutter. So we don't address the problem that there is water coming in to try to solve it at the source. What we try to do is hide it so it doesn't leak in the car, but the water nonetheless still goes through. So the problem with roofs and decks is especially the decks, they're very expensive and very unpopular project, simply because if you don't do any improvement, at the end of the day, you're going to get the same finish as you had before, but you're only going to have $3 million less in your account. Why is that? Because majority of the decks are covered with pavers, sand, topping slabs. So the waterproofing membrane, one protecting your structure, is hidden and buried underneath all of that. In order to reach the membrane, you need to dig all of that out, not to mention the planters, where you have to empty the soil, get the plants out and all of that. Same goes for expansion joints. So that is something that you have to monitor. How do you monitor that? Two ways. First, we mentioned the reserve studies. Reserve study is the one that gives you a good guidance as to what is the age and expected lifespan of that, so you start paying more attention. Second of all, is you start looking in that garage, and if you start seeing cracks, water, anything like that, that's time to act. Realistically speaking, if you start seeing water in the garage, you're probably too late. You probably should have done something before that. That's why that reserve study comes in play very handy, because if it tells you you have to do it in 10 years, right around that year 8, 9, start hiring the engineers who are going to do the assessment through a destructive investigation of that deck, remove some of the pavers, tell you how it looks, tell you what it is, and then give you a plan. Where do you go from there?
You know what, Will, it's really been kind of an eye-opener for us in terms of training our on-site maintenance supers on what to look for. Again, you never want tragedies to take place, but if we can learn and be better going forward. Will, have you found that we've kind of had to reemphasize or re-educate our building supers for some of these lead indicators of failure?
For sure, James, and not just the maintenance supervisors, but the managers themselves. As you know, we hold our monthly tower conference call, and one of the key aspects of that is that we'll bring in the appropriate experts to educate the team. We're not trying to create roofers and things like that, but we certainly want managers and the maintenance supervisors to know what right looks, smells, or feels like. And using the example that Sunisha was just talking about in terms of roofs, we've had roofing companies come in and tell us, this is what you would look for on the flashing. This is what you look for on the horizontal surface in terms of if there's any bubbling. And at that point in time, you may not know how to fix it, but you certainly know that you need to call your roof maintenance contractor to investigate what's going on before it does in fact become that larger problem.
I want to come back to service contracts and warranties and whatnot on the physical plant. But before I go there, Sunisha, you had mentioned the reserve study, and I wanted to put out a couple of questions to our audience about reserve studies before we, can you put up question 4, Mariness? And then as soon as I share the results, put up number 5. And I think this will be helpful for our audience to see what other communities are doing. But what I liked what you said, Sunisha, it's not reserve study inspections, insurance inspections, and engineering inspections are different, but it's not like they're independent. You can learn a lot from a reserve study in terms of the useful life and whatnot. So let's start by sharing how many people have a current reserve study, and we've defined that as within 3 years. Will, what is that kind of consistent with what you're seeing out in the marketplace? 60% current and 30% not. And this could be an element. I know HOAs tend to have less reserve studies, but is that
it is,
things?
James. And interestingly enough, we had some visitors yesterday, and I stopped in to speak with them, and they didn't know. So this is for our audience today, this is a key piece of information to know. You can clearly get that from your manager. Show me the report, tell me where we stand, and if we don't have a current one, what is the plan to get a firm engaged to perform?
Well, the next question we put up, well, the first question was, have you done a reserve study? And this question is, are you fully funding your reserves? And I kind of have highlighted this. We get a lot of questions about reserves, and I think there's some concern on our boards right now, gentlemen. Oh my gosh, we haven't been reserving. Now we have to. How are we going to afford this? And Will, the good thing about reserve studies is you take the cost of repair and divide it by the years left, and you start funding towards that. So if it's 10 years and it's 100 grand, you have to put in 10 grand a year. It's not like you have to put the whole amount in first year. So my advice to boards is don't be afraid of a reserve study. It's your friend, and it actually tells you how to fund it. And by the way, I think it's going to be mandatory as soon as 6 months from now anyway. So, but let's share the results, Mariness, on current funding of our audience. So we have 44% fully funded, 24% not, and 27% partial. That doesn't really surprise me. I would only say to the no's and the partials, you're likely are going to be required to as early as 22 to fund. So get with your management team and figure out, in advance how you're going to approach doing that. Sunisha, Will, any comments on the poll results on reserves?
Well, James, just consistent with what you were just mentioning to our folks who are saying no or partial. I think it is a more fair way to deal with the financial burden to all of the residents that you do it on an annual basis. A small chunk each year is a much easier burden to bear than if at some point in time you discover there are numerous issues and there's a large impact in the form of a special assessment.
Go ahead,
If you
Sunisha.
don't mind, just wanted two points I would like to get across. First thing is the question was phrased in the last 3 years. I think it's critical that everybody understands that reserve study is almost a living being. So the reserve done 3 years ago and today's market values are completely different. So even if you had a fully funded reserve done 3 years ago, you are most likely underfunded for the work doing today. So this is something that you have to keep in mind when you're doing reserves. You have to keep track of the market and how it goes and update your reserves frequently. Every time you see a market change, every time you do a project, a big capital project, you should update your reserves. So that's critical. And number two, I think that the good, honest conversation, and I think that's where management comes in very handy, is important for the unit owners to understand the benefit of the reserve. I've had many conversations with board members and people in the buildings that are very skeptical towards the reserves because they've heard somebody somewhere stole the money from the reserves or board did whatnot and they lost their money, or even worse, I'm going to sell a unit 3 years from now or 3 days from now. I don't care about putting money into something that I don't want to benefit from. So there has to be an honest conversation about both of those topics to reassure people that this is for the benefit of everybody and protecting your investment for the future.
I think that's a great point. Will, when we get a reserve study from one of the many good vendors out there, it costs a certain amount of money, but they will update it for obviously less than that full charge. We had an example last year where wood doubled. That, to Sunisha's point, it would completely throw off your reserve study. But once you get a good relationship with a reserve study provider, I think you can do regular check-ins with them on a less than full cost basis to keep them current.
And James, that's correct. That it goes back to similar to the comment I made earlier about when you hire the engineer and maintaining that relationship. Yes, many of the firms that will conduct a reserve study will give you a discounted rate on a revision.
Okay, so I want to move to the preventive maintenance part of this. By the way, we have a question on the board whether management companies can do reserve studies, and I would say that's not a good idea. It's not that there isn't a collective expertise, maybe if you're with a major company, but there's a whole bunch of reasons why you want to hire the expert, including reliance on that and the reliability provisions in those contracts. Okay. Sunisha, you gave me a good example when we talked about preventive maintenance, about how we take care of our bodies and our cars. Maybe just repeat that story as we tee up preventive maintenance for our buildings.
Yeah, sure. So it seems that we often forget that buildings are also something that requires taking care of. When we, in our lives, in our daily lives, we go and have annual checks, health checks. We do recommendations for men over a certain age to do colonoscopies, for ladies to do mammograms, and all of that is a preventative maintenance and maintenance on our health. Same for the cars. We know that we should change the oil 3, 5, 7,000 miles, whatever people drive. And we do it just because, hey, we know we have to do it. Somehow, when it comes to the buildings, we all become experts. And just because we see it from the outside and standing looks nice, hey, there's nothing to be done. Let's not do anything about it. But the same logic applies. We have to do something. We have to at least check it. So that's why it's imperative that several things be done on the building. First of all, that's where the importance of the good management company is, to advise the board on what needs to happen. And more importantly, for the board to listen and support the management company in doing so, because I've seen so many stories where management companies really trying, but the board is saying, no, we don't want to do it. We don't want to spend the money and whatnot. That's number one. Number two is implementing those on daily routines, such as, or in annual maintenance of the building, roof maintenance contracts. We're talking about service contracts, roof maintenance contracts, mechanical equipment maintenance contracts, electrical. Everything plays a big role in the overall health of your building. So that is, if you have a plan and a good cooperation between the management company and the board, you have nothing to worry about.
Well, Will, I want to we get a lot of questions about what's the best way to do a preventive maintenance plan. And I'm going to take one step back. At Castle, we always talk about hire the best people, have the best systems, and marry them with technology. And as it comes to preventive maintenance, Will, it's not rocket science. Every component of your building has a requirement, a frequency, and a methodology. And so that can be done, frankly, manually. There are some fairly basic technology, and then there's some very comprehensive, CMMS systems. So, Will, what does a preventive maintenance system look like in a building or community?
Yeah, well, I would tell you, James, 3 keys to success. First one, as you had already said, hire the right people, right? You need to know, is the person qualified for the role that you're asking them to perform? So a maintenance tech is not an engineer, by example. So let's align the skill set with the task. Planning, always critical. And this is from a perspective of both short and long term. Short term, having a program which ensures that these items are serviced per the recommended frequency. Many times you can easily find that data from the manufacturer online nowadays. It's really not hard at all. But consistency is the key. So if everything's on a program, whether, if your building is using old-fashioned checklist, or if you have graduated to one of the more complex softwares, either way, the consistency of those items being touched on a regular basis is what's going to keep it running well. Long-term, using that reserve study, how much time you have, and then planning for the impact of those major projects. So understanding what labor and materials are going to cost you, what you're going to need for project management, the best use of the engineer. And then third key to success clearly is going to be the funding. Short term, your annual operating budget for every association has a series of maintenance line items. All too often, that is one of the first places when an association is trying to control their cost will resort to those line items. And you just can't do it. It's the starting phase of keeping everything intact. And we have already spoken before about adequately funding reserves. Keep those in line. So even the most well-maintained systems will eventually fail. That's just the nature of the materials that they're made of, that at some point over time, they will come to the end of their useful life. And are you prepared to then replace it so that you start anew and you continue to keep the building intact in the form of its building envelope, which is what keeps everyone comfortable in the first place?
Well, what we've observed from the practical side, Will, is we have some incredible building maintenance supervisors that are not technologically inclined, and they literally still have their pad and paper and Excel spreadsheet. And that's okay, because if we force them into a technology they're uncomfortable with, that actually may be worse. So I really think one of the things that you've taught me, Will, is let's match the system you're using in that community with the ability of the person executing it. And I'm not judging here. We have some incredible building supervisors that have been in their building 20 years and still use kind of the paper system. They know their building, but they still use the system because we can get complacent. So it's one thing every component of your community needs to be listed and its requirements for preventive maintenance detailed. But it's not necessarily your on-site team that does that preventive maintenance. So, Sunisha, how do we decide whether we can do the preventive maintenance with our on-site team or whether we need a service contract or a vendor?
Well, I think that goes along with what Will said in terms of matching the skill set with a person you have. Any work, think of it this way, any work that would potentially require a permit would be something that you would have to delegate. You don't do in-house. So something as simple as tightening here and there, I'm sure that can be done in-house. But we talk about stucco repairs, concrete repairs, replacement of a pump, replacement of pipes and all of that. Most likely that's something that you would want to hire a outside company, because it's going to require a permit, which means it's going to require some kind of a drawing, details, engineering involvement, general contractor or specialty contractor put in place. The key is, and I think we'll explain that, is knowing what the problem is and knowing who is going to fix the problem is the key of the person in charge of maintenance. It's not that we have a jack of all trades in our building and that person or people can do everything on the building. I mean, no, it's that they need to identify, recognize, and advise as to who and how we should address that.
Well, from a practical perspective, you put in a new pump or a new cooling tower or something like a piece of equipment. Normally they come with a warranty. They also, or elevators, they'll also come with a requirement for a service contract to keep the warranties current. So how would you advise our audience in terms of honoring warranties and use of service contracts versus the on-site team?
Yeah, James, this is very similar to what Sunisha was just saying in terms of the skill set. So I always advise our boards that our on-site maintenance teams, and I use the term skill level 1, skill level 2 task, and that's things like change a filter, monitor gauges that indicate the performance of a system, be able to lubricate a component that needs it. That's the kind of thing that an on-site maintenance team can do. That's skill level 1 and 2. If it gets into the realm where there may be a significant safety concern, such as opening the backside of an electrical panel, if there's a license required, or if there is extensive training that's required, such as many of your specialized vendors, HVAC, by example, they attend certifications that are given directly by the manufacturer so that the customer knows this team coming in to service your equipment is, one, authorized to go into the guts of a piece of equipment, and two, they know exactly what they're doing to be able to put everything right back together to ensure that it will function the way it was intended to and not invalidate the warranty. So two-pronged approach there, James. On-site team does your routine things. Your third-party vendor handles the higher level maintenance requiring that additional skill set or certifications like a license.
What I want to emphasize to our audience is it's the management's responsibility to make sure it gets done, not necessarily the team that does it. But if you can think of almost like a matrix, every component of the building has to be maintained. And so you can kind of start at the beginning. What is it? When was it installed? Who installed it? Is there a warranty? Is there a service contract? And what is our current preventive maintenance action on each component? And you can even visualize. I know all these softwares kind of take away the grid look of it, but it's really what's happening. In fact, obviously Castle has some as well. It's really task oriented. Once you've identified the asset and its inspection requirement, it's just task management. You can literally put reminders using software to make sure those things happen. I know we've only got 5 minutes left, and before we leave preventive maintenance, because I want to talk a little bit about preventive maintenance versus projects and then tie it back to the need for an engineer. Any other comments that you think would be important to our audience on preventive maintenance, Sunisha or Will?
James, I would remind all of our associations that tools are incredibly simple but effective piece of the equation here that we all need. There are plenty of items out there which allow our team to take measurements appropriately, and you can have simple things that range from a couple of bucks to maybe a couple of hundred, but it does make the job of the team easier, as well as it gives them better data, which you can then refer to the third-party vendor for higher level maintenance to say, this is what I'm seeing before you even come out to my property. Here's what I have going on. And that would help them faster troubleshoot whatever your issue may be in maintaining that system. Excellent.
So often we'll do our preventive maintenance, but there is a life cycle of every component of a community, of a building. And that could be roads or irrigation or elevators. Usually it's management with the board that identifies, oh, we got a project now. We've taken this useful life to its extent. Now we have a project. When do we bring an engineer? When do we not bring in an engineer? And in terms of when in the project do we bring it in? So when do we pick up the phone and call Sunisha when it goes from preventive maintenance to a project?
Yeah, this goes back to my comments, James, before about planning. And my recommendation is always earlier the better. And here's why. That is going to be the person who helps write the scope of work for what this project will be. That scope of work gives clear understanding to any vendor who's going to come in and say, this is what you've told me to do. So it's going to lead to more effective pricing. It's going to lead to a better understanding of what your end state is at the end of this project. I would begin those interviews immediately. I would also ask the engineer once on board to help with selecting vendors, because many engineering firms also maintain very good work relationships, whether it's a general contractor or some specialty contractor, whatever your particular issue is you're trying to resolve.
You know what, Sunisha, Will has told me many times that 10 to 12 to 14% engineering cost that's implicit in a project probably saves you that or more in executing it poorly. What comment on the value an engineer brings to a project, especially at the beginning?
Well, because I'm structural, as you build a house from foundations, if your foundations are crooked, the house is going to be crooked, and basically everything that you do after is just going to cost more and be a bigger problem. So the critical point in any project, in my opinion, is setting the scope of work properly, and that's that beginning phase. Sometimes, the board and the management identify the project at hand, but you need a professional to sit with you and discuss the intricacies of such project. Most common issues are meeting today's code, especially replacing the equipment. We have a 20-year-old cooling tower and we're going to replace it. And usually people say, well, just like for like, why do I need an engineer for that? Well, the codes have changed in 20 years, and things that you could have done and you were grandfathered in do not apply anymore. And that project can go from very simple, just take it out and put a new one in, to, wow, we need to do all of this in addition, just because the new code doesn't allow it anymore. So having a professional next to you, and I want to add another entity into this mix, which may be very valuable, is a project manager. Sometimes the engineer, project manager, and property manager, along with the board, make the winning team, because the project manager handles the administrative part and the engineer handles the technical part. I know that a lot of boards see their property managers as almighty, and they're going to do a property management and a project management and engineering and all that. But in reality, the property managers have their hands full with handling the building and day-to-day operation. Just because we have a big project on our hands doesn't mean property manager doesn't do their daily jobs. So they need to be helped by a professional who is going to be assisting in developing the project from the get-go.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, it's 1 o'clock. I'm going to bring this to a close. I want to first thank the audience. The reason we have Sunisha and Will on the call today is because you asked for that. And you do get a survey after each of our webinars. And in it, we ask you, what else would you like us to bring to this association leadership series to help you? And so we're very grateful for that. But what we asked for today, what you asked for was, can we have an engineer on? And Sunisha's contact information is on the screen now if you would like to get hold of him. And this whole incredible tragedy last year in Surfside has given a new look at an old problem. And what we really want to emphasize today is the role of the board is such an important one in terms of making good decisions, and hiring the right people to do that, starting with an engineer, is important. I think that we are going to be much more regulated as a result of this. And I think that actually is good for our boards of directors, because then it's not a decision, it's a requirement, it's compliance. And I also want to just highlight the role of reserves in this whole process, because if you don't have the money, as we've learned, you can't do the project. So it's all about planning. But I think if you bring the right professionals, like an engineer in, it's going to give you great comfort. And we will watch this next legislative session with great interest to see what our environment looks like next year. So looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. Very grateful for our audience to keep returning. Sunisha and Will, really appreciate your expertise, and we'll see everybody next month. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
James.